Good morning. This is GE 6101, Readings in Philippine History. Today's topic is the distinction of primary and secondary resources. Module 2. The learning outcomes to discuss the primary and secondary resources of history, determine the different primary and secondary resource of history, appreciate the importance of history in social and national life of the Philippines. And last time, we discussed about the branches of social sciences. In conducting any historical research, sources of information are required to gain extensive knowledge in a particular topic. Some researchers rely on written sources. Well, most of the researchers rely on written sources, while others choose to make use of oral sources. But no matter what source is being used or utilized, it is important to know which from the gathered materials or sources can provide or give accurate details and information about the historical event or subject being researched on. And it is important to distinguish primary from secondary sources or resources. You will notice that at times the author of a piece is removed from the actual event being described, illustrates whether the source is reporting impressions first hand or second hand. Now, from the terms first hand or second hand, you might get an idea of how to distinguish primary and secondary sources or resources. And so the primacy of primary over secondary sources should be considered by any researcher. And so the historian's most important research tools are historical sources. And generally, historical can be classified, as we've said, between primary and secondary sources. And the classification of sources between these two categories depends on the historical subject being studied. Let's move on to the category of historical sources. And let's see the difference. And let's distinguish primary from secondary sources. So primary sources are usually defined as first-hand information or data that is generated by witnesses or participants in past events. Primary sources are those sources produced at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. And these materials are often located in the special collection of a library rather than in the general collection. But it is sad that we cannot visit our library these days due to the pandemic. But as soon as face-to-face class, or if you can visit a library, then you could try browsing on the special collections of a library that you would be able to locate the primary sources. And likewise, primary sources are characterized not by their format, but rather by the information they convey and their relationship to the research question. Well, they include letters, diaries, journals, newspapers, photographs, and other immediate accounts. And the interpretation and evaluation of these sources becomes the basis for research. And also to further distinguish a primary source or primary sources, they're also considered as contemporary accounts of an event. They are personally written by an individual person who directly experienced or participated in the said events. And aside from the eyewitness testimonies, primary sources also include materials that capture the events, such as photographs, the voice and video recordings, and the like. And these materials are considered as original sources because they directly narrate the details of the event. And as I've said a while ago, this could be in the form of diary, journal entries, letters, memoirs, journals, speeches, interviews, official records, such as government publications, minutes reports, artworks, and artifacts. Okay, on your screen are the examples of primary sources. And also, the primary sources mostly include unpublished works of individuals that were discovered after some time, such as during historical excavations and historical researches done on in public and private libraries. Well, in some instances, newspaper or magazines are also considered primary sources for as long as they were written soon after the events and not as historical accounts. Now, for the secondary sources, these are the types of sources that are produced by an author who used primary sources to produce the material. In other words, Secondary sources are historical sources which studied a certain historical subject. And also, it offer an analysis, an interpretation of or statements of primary sources and are considered to be persuasive. It also involves generalization, synthesis, interpretation, commentary, or evaluation in an attempt to convince the reader of the creator's argument. And secondary sources attempt to describe or explain primary sources. And so we could say that the secondary sources serve as interpretations or readings of primary sources. And so usually you will notice that the author of a piece incorporates his or her personal insights and interpretations. But by doing so, this detaches the original value of the component of the subject being discussed. And these sources usually contain analysis of primary sources by experts, by academicians, and by professionals. And so these actually usually in the form of published works such as journals, articles, reviews, books are secondary sources, by the way, conference papers, and documentaries. They can also be based on interpretations of other secondary sources, not only from the primary source, but interpretation of, again, a secondary source material. Or it could be a combination of primary and secondary sources, interpretations of both primary and secondary sources. And so many historical researchers also try to use on secondary sources to get different perspectives. If you will be reading history books, you would notice in the annotation that that could be based on another secondary source. But they say that relying too much on secondary sources may blur out or eventually erase the actual details of particular historical events. Not touching on the details of the event. And so these, but by the way, we should not be confused between the difference of primary and secondary sources, because we mentioned the classification of sources between primary and then secondary depends not on the period when the source was produced or the type of source, but on the subject of the historical research. We can say that both primary and secondary sources are useful in writing and learning history. But historians and students of history need to thoroughly scrutinize the historical sources to avoid deception and to come up with historical truth. And also, the historian should be able to conduct an external and internal criticism of the sources, especially primary resources, which can be said to be a long time ago or can age in centuries. And so the external criticism are sometimes called as lower criticism. It is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics, consistency with the historical characteristics of the time when it was produced, and materials used for evidence. Also, external criticism is um, focusing more on the form and appearance, and more particularly to question the authorship and, well, the content, the textual circumstances, such as the time, the place, and the purpose. And also, external criticisms apply science to a document because it involves such as physical and technical tests, such as dating of paper, a document that is written on. Now, the internal criticism they are sometimes called as the higher criticism. The examination of the honesty of the proof, if it takes and so it is therefore, and it should be evaluated. The primary and secondary sources should be evaluated. And most of the scholars use the questions in evaluating the validity and credibility of source of historical accounts. How did the author know about the given details? Was the author present at the event? And how soon was the author able to gather the details of the event? It could be, well, where did the information come from? Is it a personal experience, an eyewitness account, or a report made by another person? Did the author conclude based on a single source or on many sources of evidence? And so if the evaluation of the source or of the available source shows any indication that it is just an interpretive work rather than a factual first-hand account, then it is considered as a secondary source. So, to conclude, in conducting historical research, it is important to identify first whether the available sources are primary or secondary sources. Yes, because this is to determine how reliable and helpful these sources are.